1965 and 1969, your wage increases were completely eaten up by price increases. Your paychecks were higher, but you were no better off.
Inflation, the great thief of time. You hear suits on television and in politics use this word quite often.
Inflation soared to its highest level in over a decade.
Inflation
is here for quite a while.
But you have to ask yourself, do you really know what it is? Do you fully comprehend the consequences of it? The depths at which it destroys the very world around you? Do you know how it's created? And more importantly, who creates it? Economist John Maynard Keynes once said about inflation, "There is no subtler or surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debase the currency." The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner which only one man in a million is able to diagnose. Money is the lifeblood of any economy, and inflation is cancer. It slowly kills the economy over time, making it weaker, eating away at its citizens. It does not discriminate. It does not care about your gender, age, race, or religion. It will destroy capitalist and communist economies. The laws of money are universal, and they cannot be manipulated. History has proven that when a currency begins to dissolve, society is not too far behind. Time has shown that money is what it is and does what it does. This is the Guide to Inflation. Inflation is defined as a continuing rise in the general price level, usually attributed to an increase in the volume of money and credit relative to available goods and services, which is a really long-winded way of saying an increase in prices caused by an increase in money. Which leads to the question, how exactly is money created, and who creates it? Money is created by three things: banks, the government, and the Federal Reserve. Most people think of money printing like they would newspaper printing. They imagine it happens in a room somewhere, where giant sheets of money are printed out. But the fact is, most money in the modern economy is created digitally, through credit and debt. To explain how inflation works, how it creates an increase in costs, let's look at a sector of the economy most affected by it: real estate. Say a neighborhood has 5 homes for sale, but 50 different people interested in those homes have all been pre-approved for mortgage loans. This lack of supply and excess of demand will lead to a bidding war, driving up the cost of the homes. The remaining 45 people may decide to build new homes instead of buying existing ones. This will create a need for the items used to build homes, things like lumber, electrical wiring, and plumbing. If there aren't enough of these items available, contractors who build the homes may have to bid up the price to get their hands on them. Along with that, companies who supply the goods may have to increase their production to meet the increase in demand. Lumber companies may have to go buy more machinery used to cut down trees and get more trucks to haul it and pay for the labor to do all this extra work. All of these things increase their cost of doing business, which they will pass on to consumers. This applies to simpler and smaller items than just homes. If demand for televisions were to suddenly increase, TV manufacturers may not be prepared to meet the increase in demand. They may have to compete with computer manufacturers to get their hands on certain parts. They may have to open another factory, hire more people, and keep more parts in stock. This effect can pass down the line. Television manufacturers may compete with computer manufacturers for screens. This high demand may increase the cost for screen manufacturers in the same way, even down to the company that mines the quartz sand used to make computer and television screens. There are many steps involved in making one simple item. An increased cost can affect every one of these steps along the way, leading to a significant price increase by the time a product is fully manufactured. This is why oil prices are so important to consider when it comes to inflation. All of these products and the raw materials used to produce them are moved around using trucks, planes, trains, farming equipment, and boats, all of which use oil.
Today, the average gas price in America hit an all-time record high of over $4 per gallon. Okay, that stings, but a clean conscience is worth $1 or $2. I'm willing to pay $4 a gallon. Hell, I'll pay $15 a gallon.
It's not just about you filling up your tank. Gas prices affect more than just your personal gas tank. Added on to this is the fact that inflation has a way of feeding into itself, which can often lead to shortages and further inflation. As costs increase, people often decide to buy more. If you buy a new pair of shoes today, knowing they'll probably cost an extra $25 a year from now, you might consider it a good idea to buy 2 pairs today instead of 1. The inflation itself creates an increase in demand, which creates more inflation. Anytime there is more demand for an item than there is supply, there will be a price increase. If the demand for homes increases by 20% and the supply does not increase by that same amount, you will see either a shortage, inflation, or both. Now that you have an understanding of how inflation works, let's take a look at the culprits, how they create inflation, and how it benefits them to the detriment of everyone else. I will split this up into 3 simple, easy-to-understand sections: banks, the government, and the Federal Reserve. First and foremost, we'll start with the Fed.
It's really of your own will and leave some of the happiness you bring.
What is the Federal Reserve?
The Federal Reserve.
Often referred to as simply the Fed, the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. It's the bank of banks. It was created under some very shady circumstances in the year 1913. Worth noting that it came into existence right before the Roaring '20s, which were immediately followed by the Great Depression. That was not a simple coincidence. It was created with the intention to maximize employment and stabilize prices. And let me tell you, it's done a real shit job. It stabilized prices all right, in an upward direction. And it increases employment by injecting money into the economy, creating a bubble, leading to massive layoffs when the bubble finally pops. What is the point of creating extra jobs if in doing so, you must devalue the money people earn at those jobs? Jobs existed long before the Federal Reserve was ever created. Politicians and bankers try to claim the Federal Reserve is a private entity, separate from the government. This is pretty much bullshit. It's a half-truth at best. The Fed was supposed to be separate from the government, so it would be outside of political influence. So it wouldn't make economic and monetary decisions based on what politicians seeking re-election wanted. The problem is, that's exactly what it does anyway. The only difference is that you can elect politicians, but not members of the Federal Reserve. The Fed has several methods it uses to create inflation, most of which they do through the banking system. We'll take a look at the first 2, starting with reserve requirements. When you go to the bank and get a loan, do they go to the vault and hand you the cash? No. So where does the money come from? Mostly from thin air. It's created when you borrow the money. Banks keep what are called reserve requirements. When you deposit money at the bank, they keep a small percentage of it. The rest of it, they lend out. The amount they are required to keep on reserve is set by the Federal Reserve Bank. They control the flow of money by controlling the flow of credit. How do they do this? They have several ways. The first is through the reserve requirement they set for banks. Say you go to the bank and deposit $1,000, and they're required to set aside 10%, equaling $100. The remaining $900 they lend out with interest. You spend the $1,000 while the $900 is still out on loan. This has inflated the money supply, putting an extra $900 into the economy. But let's say they claim the entire $1,000 as the reserve requirement. Now they have a larger base to build a much larger loan structure on top of. They can now dish out $9,000 worth of loans on top of this $1,000. Now let's say the Federal Reserve lowers its reserve requirement from 10% all the way down to 5%. The bank could effectively take that $1,000 and turn it into $19,000 worth of loans. With a reserve requirement of 10%, $100 billion injected into the banking system could create nearly an additional $1 trillion in the economy. Imagine this spread across several banks for several deposits. You deposit $1,000 into your bank. They loan out most of it. Some of that money gets deposited into other banks, and they do the same thing. This process is known as fractional reserve banking, because they keep a fraction of your deposit on reserve. The effect it has of creating more money is what is known as the money multiplier effect. We used to have a gold standard in place, so citizens could use it as a check on the banks to prevent this type of thing from getting out of control. Although, they still did it regardless. But it gave citizens a weapon against inflation, a way of holding government and banks accountable. Eventually, governments and banks saw it as too much of a nuisance. It restricted them, and they got rid of it, using the same old trick of telling people it was for their own best interest.
I have directed Secretary Comley to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
It should be worth noting that as of March 26, 2020, the Federal Reserve reduced the required reserve rate to exactly 0%. The second way they create inflation is through the federal funds rate, which is simply the interest rate at which banks lend to each other. Let's say I have a friend named Bob. Bob manages a bank. Bob gets a little loan happy and depletes most of his cash reserves, and he's short on his reserve requirement. He could borrow money from another bank at the amount set by the Fed. If another private bank won't borrow him the money, the Fed itself will. The lower the interest rate, the more banks will lend out. When the Fed funds rate is low, banks will risk lending out more money because they can borrow from another bank for cheap. The more banks that are lending out money, the more competitive they will get with their interest rates to attract more customers. The more competitive they get with interest rates, the more loans they will give out to maximize their profits. The more loans they give out, the more money is created and ejected into the economy, creating inflation.
This week, one sale that stands above the rest. It's the 24-month 0% sale.
Put nothing down, not even the taxes.
And your interest rate for 24 months is zero. Nada.
That's right. 0% financing.
Look at 5 years to pay for it with interest-free financing.
0 down, 0 due at signing, and 0 security deposit.
This infects our entire economy with debt. It essentially turns debt into money.
Another thing that is surging is debt, which is now at record levels for a lot of folks out there. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York says U.S. households' debt hit a new record of more than $15 trillion.
The question you need to ask here is why? Why would the Federal Reserve keep interest rates so low for so long? Because it creates economic growth, or at least what appears to be economic growth. But the truth is, it's all based on debt. Let me give you a real-life example to help explain. Let's say you're driving through a neighborhood, and you notice 2 houses that are nicer than the rest. You get curious and decide to knock on their doors and ask what they did to afford such beautiful homes. The first guy tells you that the house wasn't that nice when he first bought it. But over the course of several decades, he worked hard, saved his money, and slowly remodeled the house into what it currently is. It was slow growth, but it was real growth that was earned and cannot be taken away from him, built upon a sturdy foundation. It was built using his production and savings. Now you go knock on the second guy's door. He tells you that the entire house was paid for using loans and debt. He put it all on credit cards. Now he's taking out loans to pay off the original loans. He tells you he just got his credit limit increased and is having a pool put in next week. Sure, from the outside, these two houses look equal, but once you scratch the surface, you quickly realize that only one of them is truly sustainable. The other one is built upon a weak foundation of debt, which is bound to crumble. Several months later, you drive back to the neighborhood to see if the second homeowner, who paid for everything using debt, has been foreclosed on yet. But to your surprise, the situation is quite the opposite. You find out that every single other house in the neighborhood is now just as nice as the original two. Everyone else found out about using debt to game the system. The entire neighborhood is now a luxury neighborhood on the outset. But underneath it all is a huge lie built upon money creation and debt. Here's the kicker. This is now spreading to other neighborhoods as well. This may work out for some people. They may be able to borrow money and increase the value of their home, and eventually sell it for a profit. But the cost of this is passed on to society as a whole via price inflation. As money is borrowed and used to increase the value and cost of the homes, younger generations fall behind as they cannot keep up with rising prices. Not only are prices rising because debt is so cheap, but the interest rates that make the debt so cheap also mean that anyone saving up for a home is not earning any interest on their savings, falling behind even further still. What you have here are the makings of a soon-to-be, ever-growing generational wealth gap. It's generational theft. That's what debt is. The people hurt most by these low interest rate policies are future generations who will find the cost of essential items they need getting further out of reach. Things like housing, cars, college tuition, and stocks for retirement funds all become inflated and more difficult for the middle class and younger generations to obtain. Those who did not enter the game at the right time soon find themselves priced out and left behind. Debt is passing the buck down to your future self. When we turn our entire monetary system into debt, we are passing the buck onto future generations. They will pay the cost. They will most likely also turn into socialists. And to be honest, I don't blame them. If capitalists and entrepreneurs want younger generations to embrace capitalism rather than reject it, they need to do a better job of calling this stuff out and rejecting it, rather than gaming the system and profiting from it, creating more inflation to the benefit of themselves and to the detriment of everyone else. Earlier, I told you that politicians played a role in all of this, too. Since the dawn of money, governments and politicians have been destroying their own empires with irresponsible monetary policy.
Moving on now, protests, thousands took to the streets of Argentina's capital Buenos Aires against the government's debt deal with the International Monetary Fund.
Overseas now to Greece, a country on the brink of collapse. Banks shuttered, ATMs running out of cash, and now echoes in our country. A tragedy is unfolding in Lebanon. Inflation has driven the country's currency to historical lows. The crash highlights a grave economic crisis that has left half the population living below the poverty line.
Turkey's currency, the lira, has tumbled to an all-time low against the US dollar, one day after Turkey's president cited Muslim teachings to justify his decision not to raise interest rates to stabilize the currency.
The price of basic commodities in Zimbabwe has shot up this week. It's worsening the plight of already cash-strapped citizens. As the United Nations World Food Programme predicts food shortages in Zimbabwe this year, it says this will be brought on by an economic meltdown, price increases, and poor agriculture harvest. The cost of basic commodities in Zimbabwe suddenly shot up this week, worsening the plight of already cash-strapped citizens.
A boost for Zimbabwe's ailing economy. The country has received a cash injection of almost $1 billion from the International Monetary Fund.
As nations around the world struggle to emerge from the global economic crisis, Are financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund helping or hindering the recovery? The IMF says its policies are designed to help nations in recession restructure their economies and eliminate wasteful spending. But critics argue the IMF is pushing both countries further into debt by giving them fresh loans instead of aid. They say such lending practices exacerbates the cycle of deficit and poverty.
Government debt plays a large role in all of this, so it's important to understand. Government spending is funded in two ways, through taxes and debt. The difference in what government spends versus what it collects in taxes is called the deficit. Just think of it this way. You earn $5,000 a month, but you spend $7,000 a month. Your deficit is $2,000 per month. Every year, your deficit is added to your total debt. This is how government deficit and debt works. Government debt is paid for by issuing what are called bonds, bills, and notes. The main difference between them is the time frame they represent. Debt that is to be repaid in a short-term time frame is called a bill. A medium time frame, usually around 10 years, is a note. And a longer-term debt to be repaid in 20 to 30 years are called bonds. All of these pay you back what you originally paid for them, plus interest. For simplicity's sake, I will only use bonds in this example going forward. These bonds are essentially government IOUs.
What is this? What is this? Where's all the money? That's as good as money, sir. Those are IOUs.
Why are they Because the return they offer often does not keep up with inflation. Let's say you have a friend, and that friend asks you to borrow him money. He says he'll pay you back in 10 years at 1.5% interest per year. But you know that inflation is at least 2% each year, if not more. So you're going to be losing money borrowing it to him. You could make more putting that money somewhere else. Nonetheless, it is a guaranteed return on your money. Losing 0.5% a year is better than losing 2% each year to inflation by keeping the money in a savings account. And make no mistake, when you save your money, you are losing it. The longer you keep it in a savings account, the more it's losing value because of inflation. The age-old expression, a penny saved is a penny earned, no longer applies in this monetary environment. You are far better off putting your money into assets such as stocks and real estate than a savings account. That is not financial advice, by the way. Or whatever the fuck it is you're supposed to say on the internet so you don't get faced with litigation.
I'm not a licensed financial advisor.
Something important to know about bonds is this. Their price and the return they offer, commonly called the coupon rate, act in a seesaw motion to one another. When demand for bonds is low, they will have to increase interest rates to attract more buyers. When demand for bonds is high, they don't have to sweeten the pot as much, and the yields decrease. This keeps bonds on a sort of even keel with one another. Let's say you spend $500 on a bond that gives a 2% return. 1 year later, a $500 bond gives a 4% return. No one will buy your bond with a 2% return when bonds are now giving a 4% return, unless the $500 purchase price is lowered. So your bond offers a smaller return now compared to others, but the purchase price is adjusted downwards to make up for it, making it more appealing to buyers. And the opposite of that. You buy a $300 bond that gives a 6% return. 1 year later, a $300 bond gives a 4% return. The value of your bond has now increased. When the value increases, the cost will too. So your bond offers a larger return, but the upfront cost has now increased, making it less appealing to buyers. Whether intentional or not, and I think it's intentional, the government uses bonds along with inflation to corner you into giving them your money. They offer a return rate that just barely keeps up with inflation, if at all, but they are considered much safer than stocks, which can have volatile prices. So rather than keeping your money in a savings account where it will lose value to inflation, many people will put their money into government bonds in hopes of at least keeping up with inflation. It's important to have a basic understanding of how government debt works, because knowing this leads us to the next method the Federal Reserve uses to create inflation, which is called quantitative easing.
You were skeptical at one time of some of the things that Chair Bernanke did during the financial crisis.
So I and a number of others raised questions about quantitative easing, and I felt that was my obligation and the right thing to do. I hope I did it in a constructive way. And some years ago, I came to the view that that the risks I'd identified really didn't come to bear.
Oh, what a lie! Oh.
Last month, Bernanke announced the Fed's intent to buy $600 billion in U.S. Treasury securities, which is supposed to have the effect of lowering rates on long-term loans for things like cars and homes. Bernanke wanted to emphasize that these are the Fed's own reserves. It's not tax money, and it doesn't add to the federal deficit.
Yeah, except it is a tax because it increases inflation, which is a hidden tax. And it does increase the deficit, just not directly. It does it indirectly by encouraging deficit spending through lower interest rates. This is the word trickery these f***ers just love to use. It's lying by omission. They got the idea of quantitative easing from the Bank of Japan, the Japanese central bank. Yeah, great idea. Japan, an economy that has been infamously stagnant since, the 1990s. Yeah, just copy what they're doing. What could possibly go wrong?
How long is this sustainable for? Because the more and more the BOJ continues to buy bonds, the more illiquid the markets become, the more distorted. Where does this end?
A surge in work-related deaths is forcing Japan to take a hard look at its office culture.
Japanese phenomenon of karoshi, or death from overwork.
Reality is that in Japan, workers are working ridiculous hours.
Grieving father Sekigawa says while Americans work overtime to get ahead, Japanese work extreme overtime because they are forced to. Last year, just under 2,000 Japanese committed for reasons linked to their jobs, a number that has remained stubbornly high for 2 decades. Families of karoshi victims say the government's proposal to cap overtime at 100 hours a month and exempt many professions won't stop people from working themselves to death.
This is what happens when a country's currency goes to shit. Let Japan be a warning to the rest of the world. What happens when governments and central banks destroy their currencies through inflationary policies?
People are exhausted. They are tired of working 50 or 60 hours a week. They are tired of not being able to spend enough time with their children. An explosion of technology and worker productivity, a global economy, and yet the middle class continues to decline.
An increase in productivity is essentially canceled out with increases in inflation. This is why nations will oftentimes see an increase in productivity, yet workers still work longer hours.
Don't accept the options or the worldview given to you by the media,
saying that this inflation little spikelet that we're seeing is transitory, number one.
Please stand by for further details. We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.
What is quantitative easing? On its face, it sounds complicated, but once broken down, it's simple to understand. When banks find themselves with an excess of money, they like to park it somewhere where it will give them a return. Sometimes this will be loans. Other times it's government and corporate bonds, maybe even stocks. If the Fed wants to inject money into the economy in an attempt to create more debt-based growth, it will use quantitative easing. Quantitative easing, or QE for short, is where the Fed will create money by buying assets. it will buy things like government and corporate bonds. How does this create money? In a couple of ways. For one, buying assets increases their demand. When their demand increases, so will their price. If you own several government bonds, which you purchased for $500, and the Fed engages in QE, the price of your bonds may go up to, say, $700. Now you can try and sell each of them for a profit of $200. This $200 profit you made from each bond came from the Federal Reserve stepping in and buying bonds with money they created from thin air. It creates money by artificially driving up demand. The demand wasn't actually there. The Fed created it using quantitative easing. Maybe no one wants to buy your bonds. You may have a difficult time selling them, but the banks won't. If they want to sell their bonds and aren't able to find anyone willing to buy them, the Fed will step in as a buyer of last resort, injecting banks with extra money that the Fed created.
When the public loses confidence in its bank or in the banking system, and everybody tries at the same time to get their money out of the bank. So it's the central bank or the monetary authority, in a sense, just completely opens up its floodgates of liquidity and gives the banking system the wherewithal that they need to satisfy the demand.
The second way that QE creates money is by lowering long-term interest rates. Remember earlier when I said increased demand for bonds lowers their interest rate? When more people buy bonds, the coupon rate or return they offer is lowered. This applies to not only government bonds, but also corporate bonds. When the Fed uses QE to buy bonds, they artificially lower interest rates, thus effectively lowering the rental price of money for the government and corporations. This cheap money encourages debt, which again inflates the money supply. The argument here is that QE spurs economic activity. It encourages debt and spending. But at what cost? The government knows it can continue to issue debt even if no one wants to buy it. This is like a teenager who spends too much on a credit card and keeps doing it because they know that no matter what, mommy and daddy will be there to bail them out. Government, corporations, and the wealthy are often able to borrow money at an interest rate that is less than inflation. If inflation is 3% and you are able to borrow money at 1.5%, you come out ahead in taking on the debt, while regular people are stuck with less favorable interest rates in a currency that is continually devalued. This is the reason for the increase in the wealth gap. Our money is now debt. I cannot stress this point enough. Holding cash only ensures that each year it will get you less. Our money sucks. It is broken. This only benefits a select group of people. It is not a sustainable way to run an economy. There's a role politicians play in all of this. The question is, how do they benefit? Why does the government do it? What are they getting out of the deal? You see, the political class in DC are also some of the greatest benefactors of inflation. Politicians will often, if not always, overpromise on the campaign trail in order to get elected.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
Politicians favor using government debt to fund their promises because it's an indirect form of taxation on us, the people. Government debt is much like personal debt. You buy something on a credit card because you want or need it now, but don't have the money for it. You will end up paying for it in the future, with added interest. That means in the future, you will have less money to spend on things because you will have to pay for things you acquired in the past. Governments will have to cover these costs in the future by either increasing taxes on their citizens,
They will pay more in taxes.
or by reducing their benefits.
And the president has raised the stakes for today's meeting. Sources here say he's ready to make an offer for a dramatic restructuring of the entire federal fiscal outlay, It could include cuts in all the major entitlement programs, including Social Security.
When a politician tells you,
this bill is $1.5 trillion, it's the annual spending bill, but there's also increases in it.
what they don't factor in, because they're either idiots or liars, is the fact that the program itself will create inflation. The debt they issue will likely create money that currently does not exist, thus increasing the cost of the program itself in a few years' time. So the stated cost they like to give is never accurate. Every government program only gets more expensive over time because it itself creates inflation.
Numbers out this week show the federal budget deficit taking a big jump over the last spending year despite significant economic growth.
Just 3 years ago, 2015, the deficit that year was $439 billion.
When the quality of your life is worsened, who will you go to? As inflation increases, people struggle and turn to government for solutions. But that only makes it worse, thus continuing the cycle and creating a dependency problem. It's a win-win for them. It's like a doctor injecting you with cancer with his right hand and giving you the cure with his left hand, all while bragging about how great he is for curing your cancer. Inflation makes government debt cheaper. Inflation reduces the cost of government debt. As inflation increases, so does the government's collected tax revenue. Taxes collected by government are based on percentages of things like cost and income, both of which increase along with inflation. 10% of $100 is a lot more than 10% of $2. Think of it this way. When costs increase, you pay more for your house, which means you pay more in taxes for your house. This same thing applies to cars as well as other purchases. You are the one paying for it. Yes, tax brackets are adjusted for inflation. For instance, between 2021 and 2022, a year when the US saw record inflation numbers, the top end of the tax bracket for average income in the US, between roughly 40 to 90K, only adjusted 3% in either direction. You can bet your ass government is still coming out ahead on the deal. Funny how that works, isn't it? They collect money based on a percentage of sales and income. But when they pay out money to people on Social Security or government pensions, they base that about off this bullshit number they come up with called the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. In short, creating inflation makes it easier for them to pay off their debt because it increases the tax revenue collected from citizens and businesses. It also lowers the value and thus the cost of the money they owe. Say you bought a house in the year 1970 when the median cost of a home was about $24,000, according to the St. Louis Fed's website. This loan you took out for $24,000 is now a lot less money by today's standards than it was back in 1970. So, the amount of debt you owe is significantly less than it used to be because inflation has decreased the cost of the loan. But in the government's case, the inflation has simultaneously increased the amount of taxes you collect from citizens to pay down that loan. Another government benefit of inflation is that it's a hidden tax. If they actually tried to take the full amount from you in plain sight, people would take to the streets tomorrow. In 2013, the Republic of Cyprus, a Mediterranean island, experienced a financial crisis.
The banking crisis engulfing Cyprus came down to brutally simple terms today for ordinary depositors. 100 euros per day is all that can be withdrawn from most bank ATMs. Anything to prevent a run on the banks that have already been closed for a week. Cypriots protested again today, frightened their bank accounts will be raided, angry at both their own politicians as well as the EU. All politicians are to blame, she says. They come to take our money to make up for a debt they have created.
As a solution to the crisis, the government tried to impose a tax of 6.7% on their citizens' bank deposits, aka their checking accounts.
Nicosia's schools emptied as they rushed out onto the streets in the thousands, marching on the presidential palace to vent their anger at Cyprus's incredible financial collapse. And these school kids and students really do think that the European Union and IMF are stealing their future.
Blaming the politicians, everyone ruined our lives. We have no future. This is the end.
Chairman Powell, do you think that the U.S. should go back to the gold standard for our currency?
Every country in the world abandoned the gold standard some decades ago.
In other news, the number of births in South Korea continued to decline last year and in fact reached a new all-time low.
Every 12 minutes, a South Korean is declared bankrupt.
Like many middle-class South Koreans, Lim's family is cracking under a painful leap in property prices.
Every country in the world abandoned the gold standard.
Now China's economic boom is unraveling. Its economy is fueled by debt and it's coming apart.
But nationwide, the number of marriage registrations has been falling for 7 years in a row. About a half a century ago in China, if you had a bike, a sewing machine, a watch, and a radio, you would have been considered the perfect suitor. Housing prices keep rising in China. Data shows that Chinese people are getting married later in life so that they can handle the mortgage and the cost of raising a child.
Every country in the world abandoned the gold standard.
What is the immediate impact of what's going on with the yen? And is there a line in the sand, in your view, as to how low it can go?
The Japanese population has fallen for 10 years in a row.
The national debt has reached an unwanted landmark, passing £2 trillion for the first time.
In this special edition, we're focusing on a significant global trend, a dramatic drop in birth rates.
The housing system in London really is a pretty disastrous system.
Every country in the world abandoned the gold standard some decades ago.
But now marriage rates in the U.S. are at historic lows.
The state of this country may be influencing a record number of Americans against having children. Millennials hold just 5% of the nation's wealth, unlike the boomers before them who held about 21% of the nation's wealth at the same age. It's pretty impossible to buy a home to raise kids if you don't have the cash or collateral to make it happen. Millennials also facing mountains of student debt at such high rates that monthly minimums barely pay off the monthly interests.
Every country in the world abandoned the gold standard some decades ago.
Wages in America have stagnated since the early 1970s.
I have directed Secretary Comley to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
When adjusted for inflation, wages have remained virtually unchanged over the last 50 years.
The desire not to go back to the gold standard is something that you have in common with the CEOs of the seven of the world's globally systemic important banks who were before us in April and said the same thing.
At this time every year, it feels like a day doesn't go by without one of our big four banks announcing another great big profit.
Bank profits are near record levels thanks to improved credit quality.
The top 10 issuers in the country are charging interest rates of 25 to 30% to some of their customers. And this is in a market where interest rates are at a 40-year low. We have consumers paying interest rates that would be considered loan sharks in my day.
Let me lay to rest the bugaboo of what is called devaluation. If you want to buy a foreign car or take a trip abroad, market conditions may cause your dollar to buy slightly less. But if you are among the overwhelming majority of Americans who buy American-made products in America, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today.
The U.S. trade gap last month has stayed close to the record high seen in February as both exports and imports surged.
In the last 9 years, we have seen 42,000 factories in this country shut down. Under President Bush, our trade deficit with China more than tripled, and our overall trade deficit nearly doubled. Today, our trade deficit is over $370 billion.
If you are among the overwhelming majority of Americans who buy American-made products in America, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today.
And they say this is just the way of the world. China is an economic rival to the United States. It does export, it does manufacture, and yes, it takes American jobs.
If you are among the overwhelming majority of Americans who buy American-made products in America, your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today.
In November, China's global trade surplus skyrocketed to over $75 billion.
You see every day how the world is falling apart.
We're also entering economic great difficulties, truly awful times. We've got inflation, the like of which we've not seen for 40 years.
Yes, we have, apart from all the political conflicts, we have a global economy which is out of balance. And what I want to highlight particularly here is the consequences. We may have little influence on how the central banks decide about the future policies, but we know that if we don't change course, we will have hundreds of millions of people falling back into poverty. We have tens of millions probably dying, possibly of hunger. So this is a misery, and we have to address it. So to bring it at the forefront of our topics here, of our program, and to generate action, that's my intention.
Every country in the world that abandoned the gold standard some decades ago.
What are the possible solutions to the inflation problem the entire world is facing and has been for a long time? The best option would be to stop inflation dead in its tracks, to stop the government and banks from destroying the money supply through endless printing. Wages and innovation can get to a point where income and prices meet in some sort of stasis or equilibrium. We could raise interest rates, which, under current circumstances, would cause an economic recession. It would hurt, but it would get rid of all the debt and glut in the system and give us a good point to start from and not make the same mistakes. We would experience a slower recovery without the assistance of so much debt, but in the long run, it would give us an opportunity to create true, stable growth based on production rather than debt. We need to produce more things at home instead of relying on countries and governments who are willing to debase their own currencies to gain a competitive edge. And most important of all, countries around the world need to end the central banking system once and for all and return to stable currencies that cannot be created without any restrictions. We need money that can't be printed into another galaxy. The odds of any of these things happening are slim to none. This is why I'm not optimistic about the future of the world's economies. Which brings me to my last and most concerning point. The reason I find inflation to be so alarming and destructive. Inflation destroys the future. Human civilization has always been built upon and fueled by one thing: hope. Hope for the future. Debt is the destruction of the future. It's the destruction of hope. Inflation destroys savings. Savings is an investment in the future. When people lose hope in the future, they stop considering it entirely. They stop having children and creating families. When the family structure begins to break down, so does civilization. With every new dollar put into circulation, the more dissent and anger we will see. Long-term thinking will be replaced with short-term thinking and instant gratification. Savings is deferred gratification, which should be rewarded. In this environment, the stock market is the new savings account, which quickly begins to look more like a casino. You cannot turn speculation into savings and expect positive results. Savings was meant to fuel investment, not to become it entirely. As the outlook for the future becomes more grim, so does the morale within a society. Government inflation destroys the morale within people, but it does it slowly, like cancer. It will be your children who will pay the price for this, if you can even afford to have them anymore. Debt is serfdom. When people are in debt, they are easier to control. As the cries to cancel student loans and tax the rich increase, as household debt numbers continue to climb, I cannot stress this enough. Nothing, and I mean nothing, will solve this problem other than to either fix or replace our current monetary system. Nothing else will fix this. It doesn't matter which party you vote for or bills they pass. All other solutions are just a band-aid over an artery wound. our money is broken.
Some big numbers coming out of the housing market today, and they're not looking pretty if you're looking to buy or rent.
Numbers from the CDC show a startling increase in the number of opioid overdoses across the country.
Total household debt rose by $1 trillion in 2021. That's the biggest annual gain since 2007.
The cost of college has certainly exploded in recent years.
It's all getting even more expensive.
The human power elite.